Out of the box, there's a level of consistency that the Broly deck in Fusion World leaves to be desired. But once we look into the main set, Everybody, Espira, and we're back with another deck profile, closing out the last of the starter decks that we are covering with set 1 Awakened Pulse, which of course is Broly, the big beefy green monster, which honestly has some incredible power out of the box when you look at the fact that you have, you know, the 8-drop Broly, which is the biggest, beefiest card in the game, and the fact that if you sequence properly, everything goes right. But unfortunately, the deck does lack a level of consistency out of the box because that's just how ramp strategies work. You need X amount of cards that actually ramp, and you need X amount of cards that are worth ramping into. And unfortunately, the out-of-the-box experience isn't there. But now that we've got the additional ramp, the additional boss monsters, and the draw power from the main set, this deck is an extremely potent and extremely strong strategy, especially when you consider that it's green's pivot. And why green is so powerful in the meta right now is because you can either go with androids and Gohan, which are the more proactive green leaders, but do have some weaknesses in regards to being aggroed down. And then if that's the situation with the meta, you don't have to switch to a whole new color. You just pivot over to Broly. 25k base on the Awakened side means that the 20k aggros that make it tough for the other green strategies to survive will have a much harder time in the face of this leader, which is what makes green so impactful with the first set. When we look at the leader, I will say there's a little bit more discussion in that regard that there isn't with the other leaders. On his front side, he's a standard draw leader, but he does have a special self-awakening. When your life is at 4 or less, you add 1 card from your life to your energy in rest mode, which is ramp, it's just free ramp. And then the Awakened side is a 25k base, but does lose his swing draw, which is very relevant. With the activate main once per turn, place 1 of your energy in your drop, draw 1 card, then this card gets 5k power for the turn. And there's a decent amount to talk about here. On the front side, you have a leader that awakens essentially at 3 life, which means your opponent can sequence themselves in a way where if you're at 5 life, they double strike you down to 3, now you're at 2, and that's a very precarious place to be. And why I feel so strongly that like you kind of need to be careful about how you manage your front side. It's probably the most important part of playing this Broly deck. Then on the backside though, beefy 25k, but you lose your draw power. And that's why you want to hold off your Awaken for as long as possible, or until you get 5-drop Goku on board, because naturally now you're not setting back your energy plan to be able to get your big boss monsters, and you're still getting your draws. And once you do get to 8 or 9 energy, and we'll talk about that when we get into the cards, but I do recommend stopping at like 9 energy as opposed to 8, depending on what your hand looks like. Having that flexibility of no longer having to charge and still being able to draw makes a big difference in how the game plays out. Naturally, we're a ramp deck, so we need ramp cards, and we're still maxing on Destructive Strength. I think the only question around Destructive Strength is whether you're supposed to, if you're the turn 2 player, whether you're supposed to use the energy marker on turn 2 or save it for later. But then if you're saving it for later, it means you spent a turn not ramp. I don't know. I'm not too sure how the math plays out, and I think this is one of those discoveries that are probably going to be one of the first things I deep dive into when the digital client comes out and we can really get some testing in. But do note, Destructive Strength is a great card. You definitely still include it, but there's questions as to whether or not you're actually supposed to use it as early as possible if you're the second turn player. So just something to consider. Honestly, I would love your opinions down below. Moving over from that, we got Vegeta 20k with a 10k combo, which is a huge deal. Has an on play. Add up to 1 card with a cost of 3 or more from your drop to your energy in a rest mode, which sequences really nicely from strength. Going from 3 goes to your drop. You take that strength, you put it into your energy. And then does have the benefit, activate main once per turn, discard 1 card from your hand, choose up to 1 of your opponent's battle cards when energy costs of 2 or less and KO it. I love this ability in the green strategies because it helps you control the board, and mitigating the early game is going to be the hardest thing you're going to have to do as the green ramp player. So having a 20k body that can also pop another card and in the late game just serve as a solid 10k combo is something I'm very excited about. And finally, we close off with the 5-drop Goku. This is the promo version, but it's the same one as him holding the cell that's about to explode. Don't worry about it. 25k, 5k combo auto when this card is played, or when a card is placed from your drop to your energy, add the top card of your deck to your energy in rest mode. Ability is obviously incredibly powerful and allows the Awakened side to actually awaken and not feel terrible, because you're actually allowed to blow up your energy now without setting your game plan back and being able to actually draw cards. It makes a huge difference in my book. I do know some people opt out of it, saying it's not necessary, but I feel like that's sticking to some very linear games that end up playing out a certain way without considering that games can play out in a multitude of ways, and having the flexibility to awaken early and still be allowed to pop your own energy, making it a big deal. Now, is there value in changing up the ratios? Probably. I mean, at the moment, I'm a 4 of each, But if you want to consider some other cards or switch it up, I don't actually mind that. And I will say I'm not including Charles right now. The way I see it, you're never really in a position where you want to start attacking the leader until you've fully stabilized, which makes a big difference. And I think in that way, the Goku giving the flexibility of allowing your awakened leader to draw without setting back your game plan is a big deal. But I could totally see the inclusion and I wouldn't fault you for it. You could also play the 4-drop promo Goku, but he does it from hand. And already Broly could be in a position to struggle with hand in the late game. So it makes me feel a little bit more iffy. From our ramp to what we're ramping into, what are the win cons? And here I'm kicking off with Gigantic Meteor because it is one of the best cards in the deck. It's a 1-cost battle trick that gives you 15k, but if you had 6 or more energy, then it's 10k. And when we're looking at a card that one card pushes for 25k, that's bigger than a super combo. That's bigger than 2 10ks and a 5k. You know, like there's so much math you're forcing into your opponent that puts them into a position to take damage. And it's one of the reasons why I think sometimes you should consider going up to 9 energy as Broly, because you can drop an 8-drop Broly and still have a Gigantic Meteor in your back pocket to either close out the game or to defend yourself with, especially when we consider that our leader on the awakened side is already at 25k. This bumps him up to 50k, which is a huge beefy number. In terms of the androids, sure, they're a 40k double striking body, which is just good. I think having the option to is great. But I actually love them more for the fact of their on play. You get to choose up to 2 of your opponent's battle cards would cost 3 or less and KO them. Whereas in my mind, these play out more as board control options that also have the benefit of being beefy double strikers. Especially when we look on where they fit on in the curve, the fact that they're at a 6-drop means you can play them down, still have some protection holding up, still be able to make additional other plays. That flexibility is something I value a lot, especially again because of my concerns that people will try to aggro down green decks and you need to mitigate that as much as possible. And finally, of course, we've got Big Boy Broly, which puts in a ton of work in terms of removing a card, adding a card to your hand. And honestly, if Broly survives on the board for like a turn, then it is probably game on your side. So an incredibly impactful card. Between the ramp and between our top end, naturally, we need a level of consistency, and that's where our draw power goes in. We got the 1-drop Son Gohan that gets to look at the top 3 cards and take a Saiyan with the cost of 5 or less, which is able to grab any of our ramp pieces, which is super valuable. Then I'm opting for the draw Goku, just clean draws, be able to cycle through our deck, see some pieces. Similar reasons as the Android 18. Also Android 18 having the benefit that she sends a card from our hand to the discard pile, which means we can set up a dead destructive strength or something like that there to set up for our Vegeta, which is pretty relevant because otherwise you're going to have to combo something away, which is fine. You're going to be defensive anyways. Odds are you're going to have to combo, and is why we include some of the mid-ranger options that we're about to look at. But just making sure that we have that additional way to be able to kind of get through some cards and see the cards that we do need. On top of the fact that in the late game, she just draws us cards, which we absolutely love. The question is getting to our late game though. And this is where I'm currently working with the Shamoan engine, a small piece of it, but I'm not entirely sold on it. I think you could swap this out for having more draw pieces. I'm not currently playing Moa at the moment because I'd rather just have the clean draw from Goku, but maybe you are actually supposed to play Moa so that you can fetch the Paragus or fetch, and the Paragus I'm playing isn't even the self-awakening Paragus because I'm just so committed to the idea that we want to stall out our awaken as long as possible, and the longer we do that, the better off we are. The caveat there being that like if your opponent's trying to set up for a double strike while you're at 5 life, you just have to be mindful of that. So there's a world in which we're supposed to play a split. Again, this is one of those things where it's very meta dependent. I don't love 1-drop blockers, but I think they are incredibly more powerful when you can tutor when they come out on board, as opposed to having to force to play them out in specific situations. So I'm giving myself the space to recognize that these actually might be bad, but at the moment I feel good enough to include them, especially since yellow aggro, when we're looking at the coolers and stuff like that, need to put in a little bit more work in the early game to be able to get rid of them while having the double up of having strong pressure. If they play like a 1-drop Frieza that puts it in rest mode, then their attackers aren't as strong into us. Naturally, there's like the 2-drop Frieza that puts in a lot of work, but there's only so much that we can do about mitigating that. I'm not sold on this package. I'm not in love with it, but I think in terms of the options that green can run, it's fine. Otherwise, you can just play more cycling, play more removal, and hopefully that gets you there. In terms of the mid-range options, because we can't just be doing ramping into our big boss monsters, we have the Gohan package. And a lot of that is not only about being mid-rangey, but it's about stabilizing. So we have our ramp, we have our top end, and we have our consistency pieces and things that help us get into the mid-range late game. But naturally, our opponent's gonna have 2 to 3 cards on board. So now that we're going into the late game, how do we stabilize? And oddly enough, they're all Gohan cards. We've got the 5-drop 30k, 10k combo, which is just so good on whether you play it, on whether you combo it. That also KOs a card. It's a 30k himself. He can attack into cards, likely gonna get rid of him. He's a good attacker. Otherwise, we've got the 6-drop Gohan 35k attacker with an on play at the top card of your deck to your life. And this is so much more valuable in Broly because Broly goes down to life to be able to ramp up due to his Awaken ability. Broly is a 25k base leader. So Broly just presents so much more work for your opponent to be able to deal damage to you, which means it's more cards in their hand. So effectively, every time you gain a life, it's not only delayed card draw, because eventually you're going to get that card in your hand, but oftentimes it is also representing 1 to 2 cards out of your opponent's hand as they try to push damage into you. And finally, we've got the Son Gohan SCR, and currently I only have this at 1. You could probably include this at 2 and it's not terrible. I'm just trying to balance out the amount of non-combos that are in the deck. But of course, if your opponent has flooded the board and you've somehow managed to live up to 7 energy and you need that comeback mechanic, I love having that in my back pocket. It's not tutorable. You do need to raw draw into it, which makes it less consistent. So in that regard, if you'd rather run 2, great. I just don't think you need to, especially since Broly can do a Gohan impression in popping a card and attacking into 2 other cards if you're ever in that position. That is the core of the deck, but there are a couple of options to consider, most of which I've already talked about. Of course, you can include Turtles. I think if you want to be a little bit more proactive, I just don't believe I'm in a position where I ever really want to be attacking until I've fully stabilized into the late game. And I'd rather just have the options be there to kind of aid me in being able to get there. But if you want to play Turtles, I don't really neg you for it. I like the card a lot. And then naturally there's Moa. Moa adds that consistency in being able to have additional searches on top of the Gohan for your destructive strength, which being able to do that on curve is a very, very big deal and might even just be worth doing it. And then on top of that, there's the Paragus that Moa can also search, this one being the Self-Awakener. But I just don't like that it attacks into your leader, so you're helping them awaken, so you're making them faster into being able to attack into you, which I don't love that. I've also seen some builds include the Moa Paragus package, but not include the Shamoans, and effectively what you're doing is just tutoring more 10Ks. That's not terrible. I don't hate that game plan, and I think that's definitely something you can consider. And I think that's one of those things where the more I test the Shamoans and see whether they're actually capable of helping me get into the late game, then we consider how we kind of flex in the Moas and Paraguses. Otherwise, if it's not working out, I think it's a very easy substitution to get rid of it. I think it's a very easy substitution to get rid of the 1-drop blocker, bring in the Moas instead, and just have that added consistency and search for additional combo. Nevertheless, of what you tech in, I think this deck is incredibly strong. It is kind of straightforward in terms of your builds. I think there's only really a couple of flex spots you can really consider. In that 4 to 5 drop slot, there's the Turtles or 4-drop Goku. In the 1-drop slot, it's like how much consistency pieces that you want. But your top end kind of all looks the same. And I think Broly presents itself as a wonderful pivot for green in terms of being the trade-off that you get to deal with the smaller aggro that kind of threatens the other green decks. And the fact that green as a color has those pivots between them is incredibly strong. Whereas I think there's an argument to be made that Broly is the worst starter deck out of the box, especially during pre-release events, because you just need that level of consistency that's hard to get. There's no question that it is a top dog contender going into the main set, and definitely a deck that you need to have reps in if you expect to do well in Dragon Ball Fusion world. There's also no surprise that he's also the most hyped leader out there. So if you guys think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments down below. And if you want breakdowns of the meta, how to plays, and deck profiles from main set leaders, we're going to be tackling those very soon. Subscribe button down there, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.